Well, first, I just want to echo my thanks along with my co-panelists to Human Rights Media and to the organizers of this event for bringing us all together and giving us speakers the opportunity to bring attention to and raise the profile of these issues. I'm an advocate, as you can tell, I'm an advocate at heart. And so any opportunity I have to talk about these issues that mean so much to me, I'll jump on it and really appreciate it. So it's exciting to be a part of this. At the CIHR, thanks Hannah for catching I'm in a world full of acronyms between being at a university and being in international human rights. I feel like my whole world is acronyms. So at the CIHR, as you mentioned, one of my main areas of focus, both in my teaching and in my legal practice, is on advocating for the rights of children deprived of liberty, which is the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. So I should mention right up front that in my discussions planning for this event, I was told that was a fine topic to cover, even though it is not. I won't specifically be discussing primarily issues of religious freedom, but I will say that this issue of children deprived of liberty does connect, I would say, on a worldwide basis to the issue of religious freedom at various points, and I'll mention some of those points as I speak. So there are three main reasons that I chose to focus my work on this issue of children deprived of liberty and advocating for their rights. The first is that liberty, seems obvious to say, is such a fundamental and foundational right, and without it, it's very difficult for children to enjoy their other rights, and that includes the right to practice their religion. That's a well-known issue in centers of detention, is that is a very difficult right to access. And I think this is especially true, not just religious freedom, but other human rights. For children who are detained, they often have less ability than adults to advocate for themselves while they're in detention. And so their other rights are at more risk of being abridged. A second reason that I chose to focus on this issue is because from my studies, I find detained children to be some of the most forgotten and deprioritized members of society worldwide. If you visit places of confinement, you'll see that the conditions often shock the conscience. And I really say that not to be hyperbolic, but just because it's true. And it's not only things, it's not only that things that are key to healthy child development are severely lacking in these facilities, such as food, physical activity and play, education, practicing of one's own culture, religion, maintenance with family. It's that these conditions are often affirmatively dangerous. I visited one facility where the boys in Malawi are stacked together like sardines, and they are placed in rooms for over 12 hours a day where they have to sleep on their sides in order to have space to lay down. There are a few small windows at the top with no ventilation in regions where the temperatures are regularly topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's one open pit in the middle for everyone to use for the bathroom. And not to leave my own country, the United States of America, out of the discussion, an investigation in my own hometown of Chicago revealed a while back that guards at our local detention facilities that house children and young people were forcing kids to fight one another for the officers' enjoyment and while they took bets. And I think for me, this is a good example of how the isolation and the lack of oversight that is common at these facilities can lead to heightened vulnerability of kids to various forms of abuse. And in fact, one major UN study recently found that the risk of physical and sexual and psychological violence is actually greatest when against children is actually greatest when they are deprived of liberty and in places where they're deprived of liberty. So in short, these conditions of detention often amount to inhuman or degrading treatment in violation of international law. The third reason that I chose to focus on these issues is because I think in some ways we're at a unique moment with a couple of different converging factors that are creating an opportunity worldwide to build momentum. And we think of these, as an advocate, we think of these as sort of moments of where there may be some leverage, right? Where we can develop momentum towards change, towards positive change. So one of the factors that I'm referring to is research on adolescent brain development, is leading to a greater understanding of the detrimental impact of locking kids up, and has sort of started the pendulum swinging back away from detention and extreme punishments. And one really good indication that this is happening is that we have some pretty great new statutes on the books that are child-friendly, child-specific justice statutes to take advantage of. And some places we're working with my clinic are in Malawi and Myanmar that have some great new statutes. Another factor that is happening is COVID. Obviously, it's happening worldwide, and COVID is a really interesting. I mean, COVID is a lot of things, right? But in the context of the deprivation of liberty of children, it's very interesting because, on the one hand, COVID has made conditions so much worse for kids in confinement. Besides people getting sick and those issues of being in group settings without protections, one thing we're seeing pretty commonly is that everywhere from Asia to Latin America, the United States, family visits have been suspended, and sometimes that's changing now, but family visits have been suspended, leading not only to isolation, mental health issues, trauma among the kids who are detained, but in several of these places, it's the families that are bringing basic necessities, including making sure their children have sufficient food. And so really core basic human rights are not being met because of this. But also an interesting impact that COVID is having in terms of the discussion around the detention of children is that there are some, actually many countries have given at least some nod to the need to release children, to thin out the population, right, because of COVID. And as they have done these sort of mass releases of children, one thing that advocates are starting to point out is, okay, you did this and the sky didn't fall, right? We didn't have, what's the word I'm looking for? My brain is leaving me, guys. Recidivism, the recidivism rates, right? We haven't seen marauding teenagers out in the streets, marauding children, which sort of puts the lie to the whole idea of detaining children. If we could do this, if these children didn't really need to be detained, well, why are they detained? And people are really asking that question. I think there will be some good research and good work coming out on that, good advocacy coming out on that. And then the third factor I just wanted to quickly mention is the UN released just last year a global study on children deprived of liberty. It's their third major study directed at the highest levels of the United Nations mechanisms, is focused on children. And that's been a huge catalyst for the movement to reduce the detention of children and really pushing that momentum forward. So I just want to spend my remaining time talking a little bit about the key questions and findings of the global study, also within the context of my own work. So one of the main questions that the UN global study was asking was simply, how many kids are locked up worldwide? Up till now, that has really been a black hole as far as data has been concerned. People just simply don't know. And so the global study took years, reached out far and wide. And their current estimate is that any year, simply in the context, we're not talking about the context of kids detained for migration. We're not talking about kids detained in institutions because of disabilities or mental health issues, or in the context of armed conflict. We're just talking about kids who are in conflict with the law right now. So basically kids charged with some kind of criminal offense. It's about 500,000 children who are in pretrial detention or prison every year, plus an additional 1 million children who are locked up in police stations with adults because their region has no child-specific facilities to offer. The study says that these numbers are considered a highly conservative, reliable minimum. I like that. That's a good standard. So basically what they're saying is the numbers are probably a lot higher. But we can't, they can't say it because so many countries simply aren't tracking this information, and there's still so many gaps in the data. And that's led to a slogan coming out of the UN study, count kids to make kids count, right? To make them visible, we have to start counting them and understanding who is there, who's locked up. So one of my current projects, and this is with some partner on the ground in Myanmar, is just helping collect the basic baseline data, right? How many kids are locked up? How old are they? What are the demographics, including, their religious status, right? How many of these children, for example, are Rohingya? How long are they locked up for, and for what offenses? Just that basic information, can be a significant undertaking. That's one of my projects. The other big question that the global study on children deprived of liberty asks is, okay, so now we have some conservative sense of the numbers. Why are so many kids detained, and why are they detained for so long? Given that there is a very, very clear standard in international law that the detention of children should be a last resort, and it should be only for the shortest appropriate time possible, right? So this is, written in ink, not only, but particularly in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in human history. With the ignominious distinction, I will say, the United States, we're the only UN member state that has not ratified this treaty. So why is this happening if we've said and we know that it shouldn't be? And the study highlighted, and I'll go through them really quickly, 6 main reasons. One is simply a lack of services in the community, right? So the default when you don't have community services and you feel like you need to do something just becomes to lock kids up. A second reason, and this is an area I work in quite a bit, is the overcriminalization of developmentally normal youth behavior. So think about status offenses, things that wouldn't be crimes if adults were doing them, anything from underage drinking to a very popular one, consensual sex between same-aged teenagers. And some of my advocacy work recently has been to partner with local human rights organizations to challenge various laws that are over-criminalizing youth in these ways. A third is a lack of resources in the administration of criminal justice. And I think this is really a huge one. So to give a couple examples, let's talk about lack of access to a lawyer or some kind of advocate. 42 member states of the UN have no state-funded legal aid system at all for kids. They don't even have one sort of in theory. But I would say, just as important is that in the places that do have them, barely any children in practice have access to a lawyer. So there may be some kind of system, but it might be, say, only for kids with homicide cases, right? And even the lawyers that I've spoken to who are assigned to children will tell me that, sometimes their first opportunity to review a file is on the way to trial. Why is this true? Is it simply money? Is it a sort of implicit knowledge that kids, because they're so powerless, like they don't have much of a voice to speak up against it or to organize against it? I think some people have the idea that the consequences aren't as serious for kids, but you'll hear me say in a minute that that's really not the case. Then while kids have rights on the books, legal rights to appeal, practically there is just no one to file for them. So in short, the apparatus exists to arrest and detain kids and pull them into the system, but then once they're in the system, there's no one to represent them and help them get out. And so the result is they go in, but they don't come out for a long time. And that's regardless even of whether they actually committed an offense. I have kids sit without ever seeing seeing a judge for longer than the maximum sentence for their case would have been, which is unacceptable. So one thing we're trying to do with some of our local partners is help provide access to justice by assisting in representing kids, particularly on appeal. And along the way, what we can do is collect information about how their various rights aren't being upheld, and that's their rights to due process and things, but also religious rights, other human rights during that time that they're detained. We're collecting that information, and so that we can then raise these issues to international human rights bodies so that they can put pressure on their member states, diplomatic pressure to follow the law. Another quick example of lack of resources in administering justice is a lack of training and dissemination of information to decision makers in the system about what they're supposed to be doing. So think of judges and prosecutors, particularly outside of major cities, one of our partners told us, well, they know that the new child law exists, they just don't know what's in it. Right, so that's another thing we're working on right now, is helping put together trainings for stakeholders so that they can understand, okay, here is this law and here's what's in it and here's how you can follow it. A couple other, just briefly, a couple other reasons for these high numbers of detained kids. We've got excessively harsh sentencing schemes worldwide. Life sentences for children remain legal in 68 states. And in the 110 states and territories that don't have life sentences, the maximum sentences for children range anywhere from 3 to 50 years. And even in places with separate sentencing statutes for kids, kids still end up sometimes being sentenced inappropriately because of that lack of training that I mentioned. Those statutes aren't being followed. They're being tried and sentenced under adult sentencing statutes. Another reason for the levels of detention, low minimum ages of criminal responsibility. The Convention on the Rights of the Child said it should be age 14, but I can tell you that, for example, my home state has no minimum age of prosecution. And this just simply widens the net of who can be detained. And then the last reason that I think is very relevant to the religious freedom aspect of, or religious rights aspect of what we're talking about today is that poor children, street children, migrant and LGBTI children, and then racial, ethnic, and religious minorities are all overrepresented in who is thought of as a child who needs to be detained, right? There's so much discretion built into juvenile justice systems worldwide. And so it becomes a really concerning question about who is being looked at when those decisions are being made, when a judge gets to make a decision about whether to detain or not, when a police officer does, what's coming to their mind. In the United States, we've got it well documented that race is a primary issue, something that is being used inappropriately to detain, but I think religion is another one worldwide, certainly in Myanmar, the Rohingya children, and also Muslim children in the United States, especially since September 11th. We have a famous case of Ahmed Mohammed, who was a boy who was an engineering phenom and had built his own clock, and he brought it to school because he was excited and wanted to show his teacher, and he was arrested for having a bomb on school property. That's, to me, a national embarrassment. I think that was maybe news that you guys heard. And we also have a lot of unaccompanied minors coming through to the United States from other countries who we have a penchant for locking up. And so one final project I'll mention that we're working on is studying the role that various factors, including a child's religious status and religious minority status, has on the decision by our immigration and customs enforcement to detain them civilly instead of letting them live in the community. Just to end my remarks on a positive note, because I know that I'm often the voice of pretty depressing topics, based on some of the trends that I discussed earlier, including some of the new statutes we have, greater understanding of the negative impact of detention on kids, and these increased advocacy efforts. The number of detained children worldwide is significantly lower than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. And I think this suggests, and the UN Global Study would agree, that if we keep up our advocacy efforts, progress is possible, and we can bring that number down even further. So that's the work of the next rest of my career, probably. And now, thanks to everything I'm learning here in this panel today, you guys have me religious freedom or religious status is something we've certainly been looking at, but it's renewed my interest in really focusing even more on trying to pull that number out in the data.